April 8, 1943. At 27,000 feet above Caen, France, Oberleutnant Ralph Hermachin adjusted the oxygen mask over his face. The cold bit through his gloves, stiffening his fingers as he gripped the controls of the Messerschmitt Bf 109. Below, a quilt of dark green and brown fields stretched to the horizon, interrupted by tiny villages that looked like toys from this altitude. The sun, hidden behind clouds, threw a dim, gray light over the European countryside, making the landscape appear both serene and perilous. Ralph was no stranger to danger. A seasoned Luftwaffe pilot, he had flown dozens of sorties over France and the Eastern Front. Each mission left a mark, not only on the body, but on the mind. The constant hum of the aircraft's engine was both a comfort and a reminder of the thin lines separating life from death in the skies of war-torn Europe. Today's mission, however, was different. Intelligence had spotted a formation of Allied bombers heading toward Berlin. Ralph's squadron had been scrambled to intercept them. The weight of responsibility pressed on his shoulders like a physical burden. Lives, his and those of his comrades, depended on his skill, timing, and instinct. Below, the villagers went about their lives unaware that above them, the fate of nations was being decided. A woman hung laundry on a line, her head darting nervously at the distant drone of aircraft engines. Children chased each other through muddy fields, laughter echoing in the cold spring air. For them, life continued, fragile and fleeting. Ralph often thought about them mid-flight, wondering how much of the world would remain unchanged once the bombs began to fall. The thought gave him a strange mix of guilt and resolve. "Ralph, formation to the west," shouted Feldwebel Kramer, his radio voice cracking under the strain. Ralph's eyes, sharp and calculating, scanned the skies. There they were, the Allied bombers, large, lumbering machines with wings that seemed to stretch forever. Flak bursts appeared like tiny flowers of fire beneath them, a grim reminder of the anti-aircraft guns waiting below. Ralph's heart rate accelerated. Every second counted. He had to position his squadron strategically or risk annihilation. As they maneuvered into position, Ralph recalled the training that had prepared him for this moment. Countless hours in simulators, endless drills over the Bavarian countryside, and a lifetime of reading aerial tactics. Yet nothing could fully prepare a man for the reality of combat. The way the world shrinks to the size of your cockpit, the deafening roar of engines, and the sudden, sharp clarity that comes when life hangs by a thread. One miscalculation, one moment of hesitation, and it would all be over. "Engage." Ralph barked into the radio, and his squadron split into attack formation. The air around them seemed to pulse with tension. The Allied bombers, aware of the approaching danger, began to spread out, defensive gunners swiveling their machine guns. Tracer rounds streaked through the sky, illuminating the gray clouds with deadly precision. Ralph's fingers tightened on the trigger, the familiar rhythm of war guiding his actions. One bomber went down in flames, spiraling toward the earth below, leaving a trail of black smoke that would linger in the sky for hours. Ralph felt a pang, not of fear, but of grim acceptance. Death was an inevitable companion in these skies. Minutes stretched into eternity. The dogfight continued with relentless intensity. Ralph's mind moved with calculated precision, each maneuver a blend of instinct and experience. Another bomber fell, but not without consequence. Kramer's plane took a hit, forcing him into a tight spiral to regain control. Ralph watched helplessly as his comrade fought to stay alive, the bond between men in the sky unspoken but profound. Every victory in the air was tinged with loss. Every maneuver was a step closer to survival or doom. Suddenly, a loud explosion shook Ralph's plane. His cockpit filled with smoke and alarms blared in his ears. Shrapnel had torn through the wing. The aircraft shuddered violently. Ralph's training kicked in. Emergency procedures, stabilizing maneuvers, and a single-minded focus on survival. The ground rushed up faster than it should, and for a terrifying moment, Ralph felt the weight of inevitability pressing down. But then, with a surge of effort and instinct honed over countless sorties, he pulled the aircraft out of the dive. The world righted itself, or at least, as righted as it could be in the chaos of war. As he regained control, Ralph scanned the battlefield. Smoke from downed bombers painted the sky in shades of gray and orange. The cries of comrades over the radio, strained and panicked, reminded him that each man faced his own battle, invisible to the rest of the world. Ralph's heart ached for them, even as he pushed forward, his mind a tightrope between fear and duty. War had a way of stripping humanity down to its essentials, exposing both courage and fragility in equal measure. Hours later, the formation returned to base, battered but mostly intact. The airfield buzzed with activity as mechanics rushed to repair damaged planes, medics attended to wounded pilots, and commanders debriefed the survivors. Ralph stepped down from his aircraft, his body aching from the strain of combat. The adrenaline that had kept him sharp in the sky was fading, replaced by exhaustion and a creeping sense of dread. Each mission was a reminder that life was a series of precarious balances, and that survival was never guaranteed. In the barracks that evening, Ralph sat quietly, writing letters he would never send. Letters to parents, to friends, to lovers. Letters filled with unspoken fears and tentative hopes. Outside, the night was calm, a stark contrast to the chaos of the day. Stars dotted the sky, indifferent to the struggles of men below. Ralph wondered how many of those stars had witnessed battles like this before, silent witnesses to the human capacity for both destruction and resilience. The war was far from over. Plans for new missions were already circulating, each promising new dangers and new sacrifices. Yet for now, Ralph allowed himself a moment of reflection. He thought of the villagers below, of comrades lost and saved, of the delicate thread that separated life from death. He thought of the future, a world that might never forget the cost of these skies, the courage of those who flew, and the shadow that war cast over all it touched. April 9th would bring another mission, another confrontation, and another test of skill and endurance. But tonight, in the quiet barracks, Ralph Hermachin allowed himself a rare luxury, the fleeting comfort of survival, and the fragile hope that tomorrow, the world might still be a little less broken. April 9th, 1943. Dawn crept slowly over the airfield near Metz. The morning fog clung stubbornly to the ground, draping the barren landscape in a ghostly shroud. Ralph Hermachin stepped out of the barracks, his boots sinking slightly into the wet earth, the chill biting through his uniform. The events of the previous day lingered like a shadow over him. He had survived, but not without cost. Kramer was still in the field hospital, his injuries serious but not fatal, and the squadron had lost 2 young pilots who had barely seen combat. Ralph clenched his jaw, forcing the thoughts away. There was no time to dwell. The war was unrelenting, and the sky demanded attention. The briefing tent was filled with a low murmur of voices and the metallic scent of fuel. Maps were spread across tables, dotted with colored pins marking bomber formations, radar stations, and enemy positions. Hauptmann Weiss, their commander, gestured sharply as he outlined the day's mission. Intelligence reported a convoy of Allied bombers heading toward industrial centers in northern Germany. Intercepting them before they reached their targets was imperative. Failure was not an option. Ralph studied the maps carefully, memorizing flight paths, altitudes, and potential danger zones. Every detail mattered. Every decision could mean life or death. As the squadron prepared to take off, Ralph noticed the tension etched into his comrades' faces. Young pilots, barely out of training, wore expressions that teetered between resolve and fear. They carried the invisible weight of responsibility, each man knowing that in the sky, courage and skill were often insufficient shields against fate. Ralph approached them quietly, offering nods of reassurance. A simple gesture, but one that could steady a trembling hand and fortify resolve. In the air, they were more than men. They were a unit, a living formation, moving as one against the threat above and below. The engines roared to life, shaking the earth beneath their feet. Ralph climbed into his Messerschmitt, checking instruments, gauges, and controls with meticulous precision. Beside him, Lieutenant Becker adjusted his radio, while Feldwebel Steiner ran a final check on weaponry. The airfield was alive with motion, yet everything felt suspended in a tense calm, the silence before the storm. Ralph took a deep breath, tasting the metallic tang of adrenaline. There was a strange beauty in this moment, the anticipation, the quiet camaraderie, and the realization that soon the sky itself would be a battlefield. Minutes later, the squadron was airborne. The world below seemed distant and unreal, a mosaic of forests, rivers, and villages. Clouds rolled in, softening the landscape and casting shadows that danced across the terrain. Ralph scanned the horizon, eyes trained to detect the slightest movement. There they were. A formation of Allied bombers appeared in the distance, wings gleaming in the pale sunlight. Anti-aircraft flak erupted from the ground, leaving trails of smoke that arced upward, like invisible barriers challenging their advance. The sky, once serene, had transformed into a theater of death and strategy. Engage Formation Delta. Hauptmann Weiss barked over the radio. Ralph's heart tightened. Every sortie was a gamble, and every decision could be final. He pushed the throttle forward, guiding his aircraft with practiced precision, weaving through bursts of flak. Machine guns rattled in unison, the crack of bullets mingling with the roar of engines. One bomber spiraled downward, smoke trailing behind it. Ralph felt a surge of relief, quickly replaced by grim determination. Each victory came with a cost, each maneuver carried risk. The sky was both ally and enemy, and survival demanded absolute focus. In the chaos of combat, Ralph spotted movement to his left. A young pilot, Unteroffizier Fischer, was struggling to maintain altitude, his plane riddled with bullets. Ralph radioed instructions, guiding him toward relative safety, but the distance was perilous. He knew Fischer's fate might be sealed regardless of his guidance. War, Ralph thought bitterly, was not fair. It was a calculus of chance and skill, a relentless test of endurance, courage, and luck. Even the most experienced pilots could find themselves at the mercy of circumstance. Yet they flew, because to hesitate was to surrender, and surrender meant death. Below, the villages were oblivious to the carnage above. Farmers tended their fields, children chased each other through narrow streets, and smoke from chimneys spiraled into the cold morning air. Ralph's eyes lingered briefly on the earth below, a reminder of what they fought for, or perhaps what they fought over. Civilization, ordinary life, and fleeting moments of peace hung in the balance. One misstep, one miscalculation, and it could all vanish in flames. The weight of this knowledge pressed on Ralph, sharpening his senses and steadying his hands. Hours passed like minutes. The dogfight raged with relentless intensity. Tracer fire streaked across the sky, and the sound of engines intertwined with the cries of men over the radio. Some planes went down in flames, leaving trails of black smoke that would linger in the air long after. Ralph lost count of the bombers destroyed, the pilots wounded, and the comrades who would not return. Each encounter left an indelible mark, a permanent scar etched into memory. Yet, despite exhaustion and the mounting toll, they pressed on. The mission demanded perseverance, and Ralph knew that retreat was not an option. By late afternoon, the remaining bombers turned back, having been unable to reach their targets. Ralph's squadron regrouped, battered but victorious. The descent back to base was quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos of combat. Each pilot lost in thought, processing the day's events, haunted by the faces of those who had fallen. Ralph felt the weight of responsibility acutely. He had survived, but survival was no victory in itself. The cost of war was measured not only in strategic gains, but in the lives forever altered, the innocence lost, and the shadows cast over every man who flew that day. Back on the ground, the airfield was a hive of activity. Mechanics rushed to repair damaged aircraft, medics tended to the wounded, and commanders debriefed the squadron. Ralph removed his helmet, running a hand through sweat-damp hair. The adrenaline faded, leaving a hollow ache in its place. He walked among his comrades, offering brief words of encouragement, but inside he grappled with guilt, fear, and a profound sense of weariness. War, he realized, was an unending cycle of engagement and reflection, courage and sorrow, life and death. That evening, Ralph sat alone by the barracks, writing in his journal, a habit that had become both solace and ritual. He recorded the details of the mission, the maneuvers, the losses, and the victories, yet found it impossible to capture the full weight of experience. The sky had demanded so much, and yet it remained indifferent, vast, and unyielding. Ralph wrote of his comrades, the young men who had flown beside him, the faces that would remain forever etched in memory. He wrote of the villages below, of the fleeting glimpses of ordinary life amid the chaos, and of the fragile thread that connected all of them to a future still uncertain. As darkness fell, the airfield grew silent. The war would continue, unrelenting, and tomorrow would bring new missions, new challenges, and new tests of courage. Ralph Hermachin allowed himself a brief moment of reflection, a quiet acknowledgement of survival. April 10, 1943. The gray dawn seeped over Metz like a shroud, the air crisp and filled with the faint smell of oil and exhaust. Ralph Hermachin sat on the edge of his bunk in the barracks, staring at his boots. The events of the last 2 days were heavy on his mind. The exhilaration of survival had faded, replaced by exhaustion and a gnawing awareness that each mission carved away at the soul. The faces of the lost, 2 young pilots, barely out of training, haunted him. He could still see them in the smoke and fire of the aerial battles, their planes spiraling helplessly toward the earth. The squadron's routine had become a relentless cycle. Briefing, mission, combat, return, repair, and sleep, or what passed for it. Sleep offered little reprieve. Dreams were filled with tracer fire, spinning aircraft, and the cries of comrades. Ralph felt the psychological weight of repeated combat pressing down on him like lead. Even in moments of quiet, the war followed him. A flak burst could be imagined in the distance. A bomber could appear in a shadowed cloud, and his pulse would spike. He had begun to realize that the war was not just fought in the sky, it was fought in the mind as well. The morning briefing brought grim news. Intelligence reported a heavily escorted formation of Allied bombers moving toward the Ruhr industrial region. This mission promised to be one of the most dangerous yet. Ralph studied the maps, tracing the flight paths, noting the concentration of anti-aircraft emplacements, and the positioning of the escort fighters. Hauptmann Weiss's voice was sharp, tinged with tension, as he outlined the plan. Every detail mattered. Hesitation would mean death. Ralph's eyes lingered on the youngest members of the squadron. Unteroffizier Fischer had returned from yesterday's near-fatal encounter, but his hands still trembled slightly when adjusting controls. Even the bravest men carried fear. It was the quiet companion of every pilot who flew into the unknown. As the squadron prepared for takeoff, Ralph felt the familiar mix of anticipation and dread. The engines roared, the vibrations shaking through the fuselage, and the world below receded into a blur. Once airborne, the squadron climbed steadily toward their designated altitude, the landscape stretching out in a patchwork of fields, rivers, and forests. Ralph glanced at his comrades. Some sat in focused silence, others whispered brief prayers, and all carried the invisible weight of duty and fear. War had a way of stripping humanity down to its essentials, exposing courage, vulnerability, and the fleeting nature of life. The encounter began as the bombers came into view, large, lumbering machines escorted by nimble and deadly fighters. The first shots rang out, tracer rounds streaking through the gray sky like lightning. Ralph felt his heart tighten. The air erupted with chaos. Engines roared, bullets whistled past, and planes twisted and dived in a deadly ballet of maneuvering and fire. Ralph's training took over, instinct guiding his hands and eyes. One bomber went down, spiraling in flames. Relief washed over him briefly, but it was immediately replaced by dread. Another pilot, Steiner, was hit. Ralph saw him struggle to regain control, and a chill ran down his spine. There was no time to mourn. The sky demanded focus. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Ralph and his comrades weaved between clouds and flak bursts, coordinating attacks and defending one another as best they could. Radio chatter was frantic, a mixture of commands, cries for assistance, and the strained voices of those facing the edge of death. Ralph found himself shouting encouragement to Fisher, whose plane shuddered under the impact of bullets. The younger pilot's face was pale, his jaw tight with concentration and fear. Ralph reminded himself that even the most experienced men were vulnerable. Skill could only go so far against the unpredictable chaos of combat. Below, the villages and farms were peaceful, almost impossibly serene. Smoke from chimneys rose lazily into the morning air, and rivers glistened in the weak sunlight. Ralph's mind flickered briefly to the civilians, to the ordinary lives that carried on under the shadow of war. He thought of the children chasing one another through fields, oblivious to the danger above, and of the farmers tending their crops. In those moments, he felt both admiration and sorrow. War demanded sacrifice, yet it spared nothing of beauty or innocence. Every mission he survived was a reminder of what hung in the balance, what could be destroyed in an instant. The battle raged for over an hour. Ralph's plane took minor hits, his uniform streaked with oil and sweat. Yet the squadron held together, using formation flying and coordinated attacks to fend off the Allied bombers and their escorts. The cost was heavy. 3 more planes were lost, and several pilots returned with injuries. Ralph guided Fisher back to base, the younger man's hands trembling violently on the controls. On landing, the airfield was a scene of controlled chaos. Mechanics rushed to repair damaged aircraft, medics attended to the wounded, and commanders debriefed the survivors. Ralph stepped down from his plane, body aching, eyes heavy, but mind sharp with reflection. Back in the barracks, Ralph sat alone, pen in hand. He wrote in his journal, recording details of the mission, the maneuvers, the losses, and the victories, but also the intangible weight, the fear, the guilt, the sorrow, and the fleeting moments of camaraderie. He wrote of Fisher, of Steiner, of the men who had fallen, and those who would carry the scars forever. The pen moved steadily across the page, a small act of control in a world dictated by chaos. Writing allowed Ralph to capture the fragments of humanity that survived the sky, the fleeting moments of connection, courage, and hope amidst destruction. As evening fell, the sky above Metz was painted in shades of red and gold, clouds illuminated by the dying light of day. Ralph stood outside, looking at the horizon, letting the cool air wash over him. Tomorrow would bring new missions, new dangers, and new tests of endurance. Yet in this brief moment of stillness, he allowed himself to reflect not on the war, but on survival, resilience, and the fragile beauty of life that persisted despite the shadow of conflict. The sky had claimed much, but it had not claimed everything. And for that, Ralph felt a quiet, solemn gratitude, a fleeting light in the darkness of war. April 12, 1943. The sky over northern France was heavy with gray clouds, the wind cutting through the cockpit of Ralph Hermachin's Messerschmitt as he climbed to altitude. Intelligence had reported a massive Allied bomber formation moving toward a critical rail junction supplying the German front. The Luftwaffe scrambled every available fighter squadron. Ralph's unit, battered but experienced, was among the first to intercept. Yet the sense of foreboding was palpable. Something about this mission felt different, more dangerous, more personal. The airfield was alive with tension. Mechanics rushed to finish last-minute repairs on aircraft, their faces streaked with grease and exhaustion. Pilots moved with a quiet focus, each lost in their own thoughts. Ralph adjusted his straps and checked his gauges methodically. He glanced at the younger pilots, particularly Unteroffizier Fischer, who had regained some confidence after the last mission. But Ralph could see the uncertainty lingering in Fischer's eyes. Every sortie added weight, and every encounter with the enemy left invisible scars. Ralph. Formation Delta, ready for takeoff, came the call from Hauptmann Weiss. The engines roared to life, a chorus of power and inevitability. Ralph felt the familiar vibration beneath him, the prelude to combat. The squadron lifted into the sky, climbing through layers of clouds that seemed to press down, heavy with anticipation. From this height, the French countryside seemed almost peaceful. Rivers gleaming, forests stretching endlessly, villages tiny and innocent. But above them, the war waited. As they approached the target zone, Ralph's squadron spotted the bombers in the distance. They were massive, their formation precise, with escort fighters circling protectively. Flak bursts erupted from the ground, black smoke marking the deadly paths of anti-aircraft artillery. Ralph's pulse quickened. Every decision in the next few minutes could determine life or death, not only for himself, but for the men under his command. Engage. Hauptmann Weiss commanded. Ralph dove toward the bombers, the wind roaring past the cockpit. His vision narrowed to the enemy ahead. Machine guns rattled as tracer rounds streaked through the clouds. One bomber went down immediately, spiraling in flames. Relief hit briefly, but it was gone in an instant as he saw another plane falter. The pilot had been hit. Steiner's aircraft shuddered violently as it lost altitude, and Ralph realized with a pang that there was little he could do. The bond among pilots in combat was unspoken, yet it was profound. They were tethered together by risk and trust, and each loss left a void. The battle intensified. Escort fighters swooped in with deadly precision, forcing Ralph's squadron into tight maneuvers. Bullets tore through wings and fuselages. Ralph's plane shuddered as a tracer round nicked the engine cowling. He pushed forward, his hands steady despite the roar of chaos around him. Fisher's voice crackled over the radio, tense and shaking. Ralph barked instructions, guiding the younger pilot, but even experience had its limits. Combat was as much about luck as skill, and the sky was unforgiving. Minutes dragged on, each seeming like an eternity. Ralph saw comrades falling from the sky, aircraft engulfed in flames, pilots thrown into the abyss. The horror of war was tangible, yet beauty lingered in small, impossible moments. Sunlight broke through the clouds, illuminating a single bomber descending in a silver trail, its destruction both magnificent and terrifying. The air was thick with smoke, flak, and the acrid scent of burning fuel. Ralph felt a cold realization. Survival was temporary, and loss was inevitable. Amid the chaos, tragedy struck. Steiner's plane spiraled uncontrollably, trailing smoke. Ralph maneuvered desperately, trying to cover him, but a burst of flak tore through Steiner's wing. The young pilot's eyes widened in terror before his aircraft tumbled toward the earth. Ralph's heart clenched. There was nothing more he could do. He radioed a silent prayer as Steiner disappeared into the clouds below. Guilt and sorrow gripped Ralph, another friend lost to the unyielding sky. The squadron fought on, but the cost was heavy. Several aircraft were damaged, some pilots wounded, and others gone entirely. Ralph guided Fisher back toward the airfield, both men exhausted and shaken. As they descended, the serene countryside below offered little solace. Fields and rivers remained unchanged, oblivious to the suffering above. Yet Ralph could not shake the weight of loss pressing on his chest. Survival, he realized, was a hollow victory when measured against the cost in lives and innocence. Back at the airfield, the aftermath was grim. Mechanics rushed to repair battered aircraft, medics tended to the injured, and commanders tallied losses. Ralph stepped down from his plane, knees weak, body trembling from adrenaline and exhaustion. He moved through the hangar like a ghost, nodding at comrades, but feeling detached from the world around him. Steiner was gone, his death a stark reminder of the unforgiving nature of the sky. Fisher sat silently, staring at the ground, haunted by what he had witnessed. The bonds of the squadron were now marked by grief as much as camaraderie. That evening, Ralph sat alone in the barracks, writing in his journal. He documented the day's events, the tactics, the maneuvers, the moments of courage and despair, but the words felt inadequate. How could one capture the weight of human life lost, the terror of combat, or the hollow victory of surviving while others fell? Ralph wrote of Steiner, of Fisher, of the men who had flown beside him and now were gone. He wrote of the civilians below, unaware of the battles fought above them, living lives untouched by tragedy. Writing was his only solace, a fragile attempt to impose order on the chaos of war. As night fell, Ralph stepped outside. The stars shone coldly above, indifferent witnesses to human struggle. The war would continue, and tomorrow would bring new missions, new dangers, and new sacrifices. Yet in this moment, Ralph allowed himself to mourn, to remember those who had fallen, and to acknowledge the fragility of life amidst the brutality of conflict. The sky had taken much, but it had not taken his resolve. For Ralph Hermachin, April 12th would be remembered not as a day of glory, but as a day of loss, a reminder that courage was inseparable from sorrow, and survival was inseparable from sacrifice. The war stretched endlessly ahead, yet each pilot who survived carried with him the weight of memory, guilt, and fleeting hope. And for Ralph, hope, however fragile, was enough to keep him fighting, and surviving, one mission at a time. April 14, 1943. The sky over Metz was unusually still, the sun struggling to pierce the lingering gray clouds. The airfield was quiet compared to the chaos of days past. Ralph Hermachin walked among the aircraft, his boots scuffing the dirt, the familiar hum of engines replaced by the subdued murmurs of the ground crew. The last mission had left the squadron depleted, both in numbers and in spirit. Pilots moved carefully, each carrying invisible burdens, fear, sorrow, and memories of comrades lost. Ralph felt the weight of these memories pressing against his chest. The war had taken much, but it had also revealed something essential about the human spirit. He paused at an empty hangar bay where Steiner's aircraft had once stood, now removed after the tragic encounter over northern France. Ralph ran his gloved hand along the cold metal frame of a replacement fighter, a futile gesture, yet somehow comforting. Steiner's loss was still raw, yet Ralph understood that dwelling on grief was not enough. War demanded resilience, and survival carried responsibilities to remember, to endure, and to continue. He exhaled slowly, allowing the morning air to fill his lungs, steadying himself for whatever lay ahead. The barracks were quiet now, the young pilots asleep or tending to their personal routines. Ralph entered, sitting at a small wooden desk where he had kept his journal since the first mission. He opened it, reading over the entries he had written over the past week. Each page carried fragments of fear, courage, sorrow, and fleeting hope. It struck him how the written words seemed to hold more truth than the world outside. They were raw, unfiltered accounts of men confronting mortality with every flight. Writing had been his anchor in the storm, a way to assert control over chaos, to preserve the humanity that the sky so ruthlessly tested. Ralph's thoughts turned to Fisher. The young pilot had grown quieter, more introspective, carrying the weight of yesterday's losses with visible gravity. Ralph approached him, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You did well," he said quietly. Fisher nodded, his expression a mixture of relief and lingering fear. Ralph understood that reassurance was both necessary and insufficient. No words could erase the memories of flames, smoke, and comrades falling from the sky, yet human connection remained vital. It was a lifeline in a world where survival often felt like an accident, a chance. The day passed slowly. Maintenance crews repaired damaged aircraft. Commanders reviewed strategies for upcoming missions, and pilots tried to find moments of normalcy in the shadow of war. Ralph spent much of the afternoon walking along the airfield, observing the quiet determination of men who had faced death and continued forward. Each of them carried scars, visible and invisible, but each was still bound by duty, camaraderie, and the fragile thread of hope. The war was far from over, yet for a moment, the airfield felt almost like a sanctuary, a place where life persisted despite surrounding destruction. Evening approached, and the sky was streaked with deep red and gold, the dying light casting long shadows across the airfield. Ralph stood outside, gazing at the horizon, reflecting on the week's events. The missions, the combat, the losses, all had left indelible marks. Steiner, Kramer, and others were gone, yet their memory lingered, woven into the fabric of every flight, every maneuver, and every survival. Ralph understood that war was not measured only by victories or defeats, but by endurance, remembrance, and the courage to continue in the face of unimaginable odds. As darkness fell, Ralph returned to his quarters, journal in hand. He wrote one final entry for the week, not as a record of battle, but as a meditation on survival and the human spirit. He wrote of the courage displayed by his squadron, of the losses endured, and of the fleeting moments of beauty glimpsed above the clouds. He wrote of hope, not naive or untested, but fragile and resilient, the kind that persisted despite fear and despair. Each word carried weight, an acknowledgment of both sorrow and perseverance, a tribute to those who had flown beside him, and those who would never return. That night, Ralph lay on his bunk, staring at the ceiling, the distant hum of engines faint in the background. Memories of aerial battles played across his mind, tracer fire slicing through clouds, planes spiraling into the earth, and the faces of young men confronting mortality with bravery. He realized that the war had changed him irrevocably. The sky had demanded his courage, tested his limits, and revealed the delicate balance between life and death. Yet amidst this, he had discovered resilience, loyalty, and the capacity to endure. The world above and below remained indifferent, but Ralph had learned to navigate it with skill, awareness, and the quiet strength born of experience. Sleep came fitfully, punctuated by dreams of flight and fire. Ralph awoke at dawn, ready to face the day, the airfield, and the next mission. He knew that challenges would continue, that danger awaited, and that loss was inevitable. Yet he also carried the lessons of the past week, the necessity of courage, the importance of camaraderie, and the enduring power of hope. War could strip away innocence and comfort, but it could not erase the human capacity to persevere, remember, and survive. April 14, 1943, would pass into history as another day in a war that seemed endless. For Ralph Hermachin, it was also a day of reflection, remembrance, and quiet resolve. The sky above Europe remained vast, unforgiving, and unpredictable, yet he was prepared to face it, carrying the weight of memory, the scars of battle, and the fragile light of hope. Every sortie, every loss, every victory had shaped him, and he understood, with somber clarity, that survival itself was both triumph and burden, a responsibility to honor those who had fallen and to continue fighting in a world defined by both courage and chaos. The war would continue, as it always did, and so would Ralph Hermachin, rising with the sun, climbing into his aircraft, and confronting the endless expanse of sky with steadfast determination, carrying with him the memories, lessons, and quiet strength forged in the crucible of combat. In the shadow of death, he had found not only survival, but a deeper understanding of life, loss, and the enduring human spirit.